The notification came at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. I know the exact time because I had just refreshed my email for the third time in an hour, waiting on approval from the city planning office for a bridge deck inspection report. My phone buzzed on the desk beside my keyboard. It was my mother. A text, not a call. "Honey, we're so proud of you. We're watching the live stream from Uncle Derek's place. The signal keeps cutting out, but we caught most of it. Dad says, 'Congrats, love you so much.'" I read it twice. Then I looked up at the stage in front of me, at the rows of colleagues and their families filling the auditorium of the Pacific Northwest Engineering Excellence Conference, at the podium where my name had just been announced. Elena Marsh, Structural Safety Engineer of the Year, Region 7, and I thought about the fact that Uncle Derek lived 40 minutes from the hotel where this ceremony was taking place. Not 4 hours. 40 minutes. I stood up, walked to the front of the room, shook hands with the director of the National Infrastructure Safety Board, accepted an engraved plaque that weighed more than I expected, and smiled for a photo that would later appear in the conference newsletter beside a quote I don't remember giving. The applause was genuine. The people around me were kind. A man named Gerald from the Portland office hugged me like a proud uncle and said, "This one's been coming for years." I thanked him. I kept the smile. I found my seat. I did not cry until I was in the elevator going up to my room alone, holding the plaque against my chest, watching the floor numbers climb. Let me back up. I need to tell you something about my brother first, because without understanding Marcus, none of what comes later makes any sense. Marcus is 3 years younger than me. He is charming in the way that certain people simply are. The kind of charm that doesn't ask anything of you, that makes you feel chosen just by proximity. He is the person at the party who remembers your drink order from 6 months ago, who laughs at the right moments, who texts you a song he thinks you'd like and is usually right. I love my brother. I want to be clear about that because this story could be read as a story about hating him, and that's not what it is. What it is a story about a scale that was never balanced to begin with. Our parents did not set out to love us differently. I believe that. I believed it for a long time as a kind of survival mechanism, and then I stopped needing the belief, because I had enough distance to see that it didn't really matter whether it was intentional. The effect was the same. Marcus's C average in high school was just how some kids are wired. He's more of a people person. My 4.0 was, "Well, you've always been the serious one," delivered with a tone that made serious sound like something to apologize for. When Marcus got a DUI at 22, my parents paid his lawyer, took turns driving him to his community service hours, and threw him a quiet dinner when it was over. A kind of "we're proud of you for getting through it" meal that I sat through and said nothing about. When I graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in civil engineering, my father shook my hand at the reception and said, "Now comes the real work. No dinner, no cake." The real work, yes, sure. I told myself it was fine. I told myself I was not the kind of person who needed to be celebrated, and the longer I told myself that, the more I started to believe that not needing things was the same as being strong. It is not the same thing. I spent 6 years after graduation building a career in structural safety inspection. It is not a glamorous field. Most people don't know it exists until a bridge collapses or a parking garage gives way. And then everyone wants to know why no one was paying attention. Someone was paying attention. It was people like me, writing reports that go into filing systems and budget meetings, fighting for remediation timelines with project managers who see safety margins as negotiating points. I was good at it, genuinely good. I had a precision for spotting the kind of structural degradation that hides in plain sight. The hairline fractures in load-bearing concrete. The corrosion patterns under expansion joints, the rebar exposure that inspectors signed off on because it was technically within tolerance and not technically their problem. I cared about it in a way that went beyond the professional. Buildings stay up. People go home. That was the logic that got me out of bed. The award had been nominated by 3 separate colleagues without my knowledge. I found that out from my supervisor, Diane, who told me with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been quietly rooting for something for a long time. The ceremony was in Seattle. 3 days, panel discussions, a gala dinner, and the awards. My company paid for my flight and hotel. Diane made a point of telling me it was a big deal, that Region 7 had never given the award to someone under 40. I told my parents 6 weeks in advance. I sent a group text with the date, the hotel name, the time of the ceremony. I followed up with an email to my mother that had the conference website link and a parking map for the hotel attached, because she had complained at my college graduation about not being able to find parking, and I had wanted to make sure there was no logistical reason to be late or to leave early. I called my father 2 weeks out, and he said it sounded great, that he'd check with Marcus about the weekend. That was the first time Marcus's name came into it. I should have asked what that meant. I didn't. The Saturday of the ceremony, Marcus opened a restaurant. Not a restaurant, technically. A food truck that had been upgraded into a brick-and-mortar space, an 18-table Tex-Mex place in the neighborhood where he'd been parking the truck for 4 years. It was genuinely a big deal for him. He'd worked toward it. He had investors and a lease and a liquor license and a staff of 7, and the soft opening weekend had been in the calendar since January. So had my ceremony. My mother's text arrived 11 minutes after I received the plaque. She watched a buffering live stream from a table at Marcus's restaurant. The signal kept cutting out. My father's congratulations was a relay through my mother's phone. The plaque is sitting on a shelf in my office right now, next to a small fern I'm slowly killing and a photo of the Bear Creek Bridge project, which is the inspection that put me on the map regionally. I look at it sometimes with a feeling I still don't have the right word for. Not bitterness. Something quieter. The specific weight of a thing that should have felt like more. Gerald from the Portland office took me to dinner that night. He and 3 other colleagues from the conference, a kind of spontaneous gathering that someone organized in a group text while I was still upstairs. We ate at a seafood place 2 blocks from the hotel, and they toasted me with a sincerity that made me feel both grateful and aware of the substitution happening in real time. These were good people filling a space that should not have been empty. I flew home Sunday morning. On the way to the airport, I opened the family group chat. My mother had posted a photo from Marcus's opening night, him behind the bar, grinning, holding a bottle of something amber and gold. My aunt had responded with 15 heart emojis. My cousin had written the king. My father had written so proud, son. Below all of that, buried under 42 messages I hadn't read, was the text I'd sent 6 weeks earlier. The one with the parking map attached. No one had responded to it. I put my phone in my bag and watched the tarmac through the window until we were in the air. Here is the thing they don't tell you about being the reliable one in a family. At some point, your reliability stops being seen as a virtue and starts being taken as a given. You become load-bearing in the way that certain walls are load-bearing. Everyone builds around you without thinking about the structural integrity underneath, without asking whether the load is distributed fairly, without noticing the hairline fractures forming in places no one thinks to look. I had been load-bearing for 32 years. I was tired in a way that a week of sleep wouldn't fix. I did not make any dramatic decisions that week. I went back to work. I filed 2 inspection reports and attended a pre-construction meeting for a new parking structure in Bellevue. I called my mother on Thursday. A normal call, the kind we had every 10 days or so, and she talked for 20 minutes about the soft opening and how Marcus had handled the line out the door and how proud they were. And I listened and said the right things and did not mention Seattle. She didn't mention it either. I'd been doing an initial review of a mixed-use development project in the south end of the city, a 6-story residential commercial building permitted 2 years earlier, mid-construction, brought to our firm for a third-party structural review after a neighboring property owner raised concerns about foundation work during the rainy season. It was a routine referral. We got them occasionally when city inspectors were backed up or when a project had enough political visibility that the developer wanted independent documentation of compliance. I pulled the permit records first, which is standard, then the engineering drawings, then the contractor history. The general contractor on the project was a company called Marsh and Caulfield Construction Group, my father's company. His and my uncle Derek's, incorporated 11 years ago, expanded into commercial development 4 years later when the market got good and the risk felt manageable. I had known about it in the abstract way you know things about family that don't intersect with your own life. Mentions at Thanksgiving, a logo on my father's truck, a pride in his voice when he talked about the portfolio growing. I had not known they were building in my inspection region. I sat with the permit record open on my screen for a long time. Then I kept reading. The engineering drawings showed a foundation design that was standard for the soil classification in that area. The problem was that the soil classification in the permit had been drawn from a geotechnical survey conducted 18 months before construction began, and we had had an unusually wet 2 years. Soil reclassification after prolonged saturation is not automatic. It requires a follow-up survey, which requires someone to order it, which requires someone to notice that conditions have changed enough to matter. Nobody had ordered a follow-up survey. I flagged it in my notes and kept going. The rebar placement specifications in the drawings were adequate. The actual rebar placement documented in the contractor's own progress photos, which they had submitted to the city as part of their compliance documentation, showed 3 areas on the north foundation wall where spacing exceeded the design specification by enough to matter under load. Not catastrophically, not imminently dangerous and this building will fall tomorrow way. The building was 4 stories complete when the photos were taken. 2 more to go. The upper floors would add load to a foundation that was already working with compromised soil assessment and inconsistent reinforcement. I called Diane. She came to my desk, looked at what I had, asked 4 questions and said, "When did you realize it was your family's company?" When I pulled the contractor history. "And you're telling me now?" "I'm telling you now." "I'm telling you now." She looked at the screen for another moment. "You're recused from the recommendation section, all of it. I'll assign Kevin to write the final findings." "I know. But the technical documentation, your site observations, your photo analysis, your calculations, that stays in." "I know." "Okay." She straightened up. "Document your disclosure. Timestamp it. I want everything clean." "It already is." She nodded and walked back to her office, and I sat there for a moment thinking about the north foundation wall, and the rebar spacing, and the families who had already put deposits on units in a building that was 4 stories into the sky on a foundation. Nobody had reevaluated after 2 years of rain. I called my father that evening. He answered on the 3rd ring. We had not spoken one-on-one since before Seattle, and when he said hello he sounded normal, easy. The voice of a man who had not registered that anything had happened between us. Maybe nothing had, for him. I told him I was calling about a professional matter. I told him I had been assigned to a third-party review of the Linden Street project and that I had disclosed the conflict of interest to my supervisor immediately upon discovering his firm was the contractor. I told him that the review had identified 2 areas of concern: the soil reclassification gap and the foundation wall reinforcement, and that our firm's report would be submitted to the city within 30 days. I told him that the city would likely require a remediation response before issuing occupancy permits for the upper floors. There was a silence. Then, "Who put you on this project?" "It was a standard referral. You could have recused yourself from the whole thing." I disclosed the conflict immediately. "That's what you do. This is going to cost us 6 weeks, minimum. Maybe the whole schedule." I thought about what 6 weeks was. 6 weeks was the difference between upper floor framing happening before or after winter rains. 6 weeks was the time it would take to order a geotechnical follow-up and get the results back. 6 weeks was, in the world of residential construction timelines, painful and expensive, and nowhere near the end of the world. "The foundation wall needs to be addressed before you pour the 5th floor," I said. Another silence. Then I heard my mother's voice in the background, asking something, and my father covering the phone and answering her in a low voice. When he came back, he said, "Your mother wants to talk to you." I heard the handoff. "Elena." Her voice was careful. "You have to understand what this does to a project schedule. Your father has contracts, he has a crew sitting on payroll." "I know what project schedules are. I just mean, is there any flexibility in how this gets written up? You said Kevin is doing the recommendation section. Can't you talk to him?" I thought about what flexibility meant in the context of a foundation that was not meeting its own design specification. I thought about the 6 stories of residential units going up above it. I thought about the families. No, I said. Elena. Mom, if the building has a problem and I write it up as not having a problem, people could get hurt. That's the entire reason this job exists. No one is saying cut corners, we're just saying, I know what you're saying. My voice was steady. I noticed that it was steady and felt something I couldn't name exactly. Not pride, not anger. Something more like clarity. I'm saying that if the survey gets done and the wall gets corrected, the report will reflect that. That's still an option. It won't be an option once the 5th floor is poured. My mother was quiet. My father came back on the line. You've always had to make everything harder than it needs to be. I had heard some version of that sentence my whole life. The wording changed. The meaning didn't. I called to give you the chance to get ahead of this, I said. That's still what I'm doing. He hung up. I sat in my apartment for a long time after that, not doing anything in particular. I made tea, I didn't drink. I looked out the window at the street below, at the particular ordinary quietness of a Tuesday night in a city that was not paying attention to anything I was feeling. Then I opened my laptop and wrote a detailed account of the conversation, time-stamped, saved to our firm's project file and copied to Diane. I had already been in contact with a colleague who specialized in regulatory whistleblower documentation, not because I thought I would need it, but because Diane had suggested it early in the process and I had learned, by that point in my life, to take the practical step rather than the optimistic one. The report went to the city on schedule. Kevin wrote the recommendation section. My technical findings, my photo analysis, my calculations, all of it was in the appendix, attached to a conflict of interest disclosure that named my relationship to the contractor clearly and completely. The city sent a compliance notice to Marsh & Caulfield Construction Group within 2 weeks. Construction on floors 5 and 6 was halted pending a geotechnical resurvey and remediation of the foundation wall discrepancies. A structural engineer the city hired independently confirmed our findings. The remediation plan was approved 8 weeks later. The project resumed. No one was hurt. The building, eventually, was finished correctly. I did not feel triumphant. I want to say that plainly because the version of this story where I feel triumphant would be simpler to tell and would not be true. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion with a clean floor underneath it. I had done the job. I had told my family what was coming. I had documented everything so thoroughly that there was no version of events where I had done anything other than exactly what I was supposed to do. The outcome was not something I had manufactured. It was something I had refused to prevent. My mother sent an email 3 weeks after the project resumed, not a letter this time. An email, which felt like a signal about how formal she needed to be or how much distance she needed to maintain. She said the delay had cost them a significant amount. She said my father was stressed in a way she hadn't seen in years. She said Marcus had tried to call me twice and I hadn't picked up, which was true. And she said she didn't understand why I was pulling away from the family when they needed support. Near the end of the email, almost as an afterthought, set off from the rest of the paragraph like something that had slipped out by accident, I've been thinking about Seattle. I don't know if we understood how much it meant to you. Marcus's opening had been in the calendar for so long and everything just, the sentence ended there, unfinished, as if she had typed it and then couldn't figure out where it was going and hit send anyway. I read that unfinished sentence many times. I understood what it was. An opening that had not quite become an acknowledgement. A thought that had come close to something honest and then stopped just before crossing over. It was the most real thing she had offered me in years, and it had arrived in the conditional tense, tucked at the bottom of an email that was mostly about what the situation had cost them. I wrote back. I kept it short. I said I was glad the project was moving forward. I said I was sorry for the difficulty the delay had caused. I said that my door was open to honest conversations, but that I was not going to keep having conversations that moved around the center of things without ever landing on them. I signed it with my name. My full name. Just my name. Then I did something I had been thinking about for 2 years and thinking about more sharply since Seattle. And thinking about most of all since I sat in my apartment after hanging up with my father and realized that the steadiness in my voice had not come from nowhere. It had come from somewhere I had been building for a long time without knowing I was building it. I requested a transfer to our firm's Austin office, not to punish anyone, not as a statement. Austin had a position that was, professionally, exactly the next step. A senior inspector role overseeing a regional team, more autonomy, more complex projects, a salary that would let me stop doing the math every month. I had been qualified for it for a year. I had stayed in Seattle because Seattle was where my family was, and because I had told myself, without ever saying it out loud, that proximity was the same as possibility, that if I stayed close enough, the relationship would eventually become the one I wanted it to be. I had been confusing geography with repair. I drove to Austin in 5 days, stopping in Portland and then the Bay Area and then somewhere outside of Bakersfield where the motel had a pool I sat beside at 11 o'clock at night, alone, eating chips from a gas station bag. Feeling something I eventually identified as relief so unfamiliar it took me a while to recognize it as relief at all. Austin suited me in the way that the right place does. Not perfectly, not immediately, but with a consistency that built on itself. The office was good. The team was good. I found an apartment with a second bedroom I turned into a home office, and a coffee shop on the corner that opened at 6:30, and a running trail along the creek that I used 3 mornings a week to think through problems I was working on. I built a life there that was mine in a way Seattle had never quite been. My mother and I email every few weeks. The conversations are careful, the way early conversations between people who have said hard things to each other are careful, not cold, but deliberate. She asks about work. I tell her something real about it. She mentions Marcus, and I ask a question about him that I actually want to know the answer to, and we move on. It is not the relationship I spent 32 years wanting. It is more honest than that relationship ever was. My father and I have spoken twice since the call about the Linden Street project. Both times were brief. Both times were his initiation. Both times he said something in the vicinity of an olive branch without quite getting there. I know things got complicated was one. Your mother says you're doing well was the other. I responded to both with something true and moved on. Marcus sent me a voice memo last spring, not a text. A voice memo, which was more Marcus than anything else about it. He said he was proud of me for the Austin move. He said he'd read about the Linden Street project in a trade publication that mentioned our firm's report. He said, and this is the part I've listened to more than once. I think you've always known what you're doing, Ellie. I think I just never said it. I sent him a voice memo back. I said thank you. I said I was proud of what he built with the restaurant. I said I hoped we could have dinner sometime when I was back in Seattle. Both of those things were true. Here is what I know now. That I did not know at 32. Sitting in an elevator going up to a hotel room after receiving an award that should have been easier to celebrate. When you are the capable one, the reliable one, the one who figures it out and shows up and makes the right call, people will sometimes let your capability become a reason not to show up for you. Not out of malice, usually. Out of a quiet, unexamined math where your resilience gets counted as a substitute for their presence. It is not a substitute. It never was. And the moment you stop being available as a substitute, the moment you do your job so thoroughly that it cannot be called anything other than what it is, that's when you find out what was actually there and what was just being borrowed from you without anyone thinking to ask. I live in a city I chose on its own terms. I do work that keeps buildings standing. I am building something, slowly, that does not depend on anyone else's permission to matter. I tend to a small balcony garden badly. The rosemary is doing fine. The tomatoes are a disaster. On weekend mornings, I sit out there with coffee before it gets hot, and I watch the light come up over the roof lines, and I think about load distribution. About how much weight any single point can hold before the system needs to be redesigned. And how the redesign is not a failure of the structure. It is just engineering. So I'll leave you with the thing I keep coming back to, the question I couldn't answer for a long time, but now think about differently. If the people who are supposed to show up for you have spent years letting your competence excuse their absence, at what point does continuing to be available become a kind of agreement? An agreement that their absence is okay, that you don't need what you need, that the load is distributed fairly when it isn't? And when you finally stop agreeing, not out of anger, but out of something quieter and more honest than anger? What do you think you'll find on the other side of that? I can tell you what I found, but I think you already know. I've thought a lot about what actually set everything in motion, not the award ceremony, not the text from my mother, not even the moment I found Martian Caulfield in the contractor records. I think it started much earlier. In all the small moments I told myself the gap between what I needed and what I received was fine. That needing less was the same as being more. That math was wrong, and I carried it for years before I stopped. There's a version of cause and effect that people reach for in stories like this one. The idea that if you do good things return to you, that the universe keeps a ledger and eventually balances it. I don't believe that, and I don't think that's what happened here. What I believe is simpler and harder, that the choices I made built the kind of person who could handle what came next. Not because I was rewarded for integrity, but because integrity, practiced consistently, becomes a kind of structure. It holds weight. It doesn't flex in the directions that cause collapse. When I found my family's company in that dataset, I had a real choice. I could have recused myself from the entire project before looking closely enough to see the problem. I could have looked the other way at the foundation wall discrepancy and told myself it was within the margin of interpretation. I could have called Kevin first instead of Diane. Every one of those choices was available to me, and every one of them would have been easier in the moment and corrosive in the long run. Not because something outside me would have punished me for it, but because I would have known, and the person who knows she compromised her own standards is not the same person who can sit on a balcony in Austin and feel at peace with who she is. The consequence that mattered most in this story was not the one that happened to my father's company. It was the one that happened to me, quietly, over years, when I kept absorbing the message that my presence at my own life's milestones was optional. Every time I accepted that, I made it more true. Every time I didn't advocate for myself, I trained the people around me that advocacy wasn't necessary. That's cause and effect too, quieter, slower, more personal. What changed was not the circumstances. What changed was that I stopped agreeing. There's something I want to say to anyone who recognizes the role Elena played in her family. The capable one. The one who handles it. The one who is always fine. Intelligence without honesty is just a more sophisticated way of staying stuck. I was smart enough to do the job. It took longer to be honest enough to admit that the job I was doing at home, absorbing, adjusting, lowering my own expectations so the gap wouldn't hurt, was costing me something I couldn't afford to keep paying. Resilience is real. But resilience is not the same as immunity, and being strong enough to survive something is not the same as agreeing that it should keep happening. Marcus's voice memo, the one where he said he'd always known what I was doing, that hit me in a way I didn't expect, not because it healed anything, because it confirmed that the people around us often see more than they say, and that silence is its own kind of choice, with its own kind of consequence. The garden on my balcony is still, mostly, a disaster. The rosemary survived because rosemary survives most things. I think about that sometimes, about what grows without much help, and what needs more tending than we thought, and how knowing the difference is most of the work.